So I'm Spike Anderson. I'm one of the rabbis here. We have Rabbi Yoshi Zweibeck here. Rabbi Ron Stern is here. Up top you have Rabbi Aaron Lerner, who we're going to pass the mic to in a moment. So I want to start off with a couple words just to put us in a particular place and contextualize what we're doing and why we're here, maybe with a bigger picture. So I'm from Boston. And anybody know what the name of the professional tennis team in Boston was in the 1970s? The Boston Lobsters. The Boston Lobsters, owned by the Kraft family, the same family that owns the Patriots. The reason I'm saying this is if anybody's ever cooked a lobster, you do it in a very particular way. Okay? What you don't do is take the live lobster and put it in boiling water. Because if you do, this live lobster will jump out. It's hot. And the way that you cook a lobster is you actually put it in cold water. And you put the heat on very, very low. This is pre-kosher days here for me. But you put the heat on very low, and the lobster, piece by piece, gets cooked. That's how you cook a lobster. So here we are entering Yom HaShoah. And it's somewhat appropriate, I think, that we're here with this conversation. There have been, if you look at sort of the history of Jews in particular situations, there have been sets of policies and laws, in particular coming out of Russia and Germany in the 30s and 40s, that very slowly and gradually started eroding Jewish rights. You can live here, but you can't live there. You can work in this part of the government, but not that part of the government. You can marry this person, but not that person. You can employ these people, but not these people. You can own land, but not here. Slowly, 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 until at a particular point, we Jews were in hot water. And these laws, Nuremberg and some of the Soviet ones, were designed to disempower and disenfranchise and isolate Jews for the fact that we were Jews. Once that happened, we were not able to react in the way that we needed to react in order to avoid the tragedies that followed. So I'm saying this not to, look, and somehow as modern Jews, we walk a tightrope, right? On one hand, we have the mantra of, I don't even know if everybody in here is Jewish, but conscious people who are aware of Jewish history, all right? We walk this fine line. On one side of the line is the never again, right? We have to make sure that this stuff never happens again. And on the other side, we don't want to be paranoid alarmists seeing a Nazi behind every tree. So we walk sort of this fine line. But we also have to, and I think this is very hard for us in this day and age, we have to have the courage to call it as we see it as things are happening. And if we rest behind the assumptions that civilized people wouldn't do this, look how civilized we are, or the assumptions that politically correct people wouldn't do this or whatever it is, we end up like another animal, and that is the ostrich, right? So the mythical ostrich, and I actually don't think this is true, but the myth about the ostrich is when the ostrich sees something that it fears, it sticks its head in the sand, leaving its entire body exposed, right? So we as a concerned Jewish community, as we see things that are fearful, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about anti-Semitism and its various forms. We cannot be like the ostrich with our head in the ground. We have to stand up, as is in our spiritual DNA, and look at it face on, name it, shed light on it, expose it, and confront it. That's the lesson of Jewish history. And so here we are when the reports, the alarming reports that we've been seeing, which I don't think are new, but I think the rate and the depth of which they're occurring is more frequent and more severe in recent months and years, of what's happening on college campuses in our backyard vis-a-vis reports of anti-Semitism. When we see these things and we hear these stories, we are naturally not just alarmed, but we're spurred to action. And I think about my own college days where all I really wanted to do was pass a class and drink a beer, okay? And I think about what all of you have to deal with, which is very different than what I had to deal with. And as a concerned adult, I'm both sad and angry, and I want to be more than just supportive and helpful. I want you to know that you're not alone in this, but I also want you to tell me what you need from me and other people like me so that we can take the challenge or the fight or whatever word you're going to give us so we can take it to the folks who are doing this in a way that it's helpful and constructive to you. Obviously, the college campuses are a microcosm of what's happening on a bigger level. But it is, I think, the forefront of what's happening. So with that, I'm going to pass the proverbial floor over to Rabbi Aaron Lerner, okay? And Aaron, will you introduce yourself and your folks? And we're going to talk for 20, 30 minutes or so. There's going to be time for some questions at the end, okay? And then we'll regroup and figure out what we're going to do next. Does that sound like a good plan? All right. Super.
Great. Okay, so first I'm gonna stage a programming coup, which is the students. There's a consensus that we should come down and join you. So Jeff, I'm gonna ask you to scoot over. Frank, I'll ask you guys to scoot over. And we're just gonna come down and have an internet conversation. If you guys want to come,
Oh, no, I got it. Here, grab some of that.
yeah, I think that's good.
And we have a mic if you need it. Okay, back there, can you hear it? Okay.
communities at UCLA. And starting my freshman year, I was on the executive boards of first year students at Hillel. My second year, I was the vice president of Bruins for Israel, as well as an engagement intern under Hillel at UCLA. Since my junior year, I've pretty much exclusively devoted a lot of my energy towards student government at UCLA, and I now serve as the undergraduate student body president at UCLA. And I have a bunch of stuff to talk about too. So.
Great. Okay, fantastic. So, one of the themes that you'll immediately see now and that you'll continue to see throughout this conversation is that these students, and I noticed actually when I walked back in, I was talking to Rabbi Spike outside, these students are natural relationship builders. And when I walked back in from standing outside, I saw that all three of them were standing and engaging people who were here already, having real substantive conversations with you. And that's actually a theme that comes out of something that Jake said. So it's true, we brought the largest contingent of students from any university in the entire country, not just places that had to fly, to the APAC Policy Conference. And one of the reasons that we do that is that we want people to build real relationships with each other. We find that relationships are both reparative, if there's something that's already happened, and they provide the foundation for people who may disagree with one another to be able to have hard conversations. And these are hard conversations. One of the things that we're seeing on campus right now, which might be an interesting place to start, is that people are very divided. And it's true in society, and it's true on campus. So you would think that arriving at UCLA is this great opportunity to be able to meet people who are totally different than you. And in many ways, that's true, right? You're going to live on a floor or in dormitories or something else with people who have different skin color, religions, maybe people who types of people you've never encountered before. But it's also true that college as a time for me to think about my own identity can often become highly particularist. So whereas you would think that it's a universal, it's more of a universalist kind of experience, many, many students come to campus and they want to dive deep into an identity that they haven't actually had a chance to dive into so far. And Hillel, by the way, is the benefit, and Jewish groups in general are the beneficiary of that. 60% of the students who we're counting as Jews at UCLA come from intermarried houses. So, mom was a Jew and dad was a Catholic, and they had a Hanukkah bush and they had a menorah or they had a Christmas tree in their house, right? And their parents said to them, choose. But in their house, they actually got no data to choose other than I like Christmas ham or I like latkes, right? Like how do you, there's no data, there's no sort of chomer, we would call it in Hebrew, to be able to look at and say, this is where I actually want to identify. And so that's true for Jewish students, but it's also true for a lot of other types of students. So one of the things that I noticed, when I started looking at my friends from high school on Facebook, is that some of my African-American friends, for instance, who were, part of my AP classes and fully integrated into the, public high school, now really only had pictures on their Facebook of them with other African-American students. And I realized that the same thing had happened to me. Like by the time that I was 25, 90% or more of my friends were Jewish, right? In fact, I think when I was 25, I was living in Israel. So, I had sort of made this highly particularist, route. And one of the things that people don't necessarily understand about the milieu in which all of this Israel stuff is happening is that a lot of it has to do with identity politics. And I think that might be something that's different than what you're, hearing about in the media. And I always want to offer something that's different. So, if any of you guys want to comment about that, that might be an interesting place to start.
We can speak on that. Should we start with sort of like a history of things that have gone on at UCLA, or should we just dive right into it?
Sure.
Yeah? Okay, so I guess I can try to give like a 5-minute version of some of the events that have transpired at UCLA over the past, let's say 2 years? Should we do 2 years? 2 years. So I think the first time that UCLA was really in the news on topics of Israel started, it was junior year, so that's last year in February when we were one of the first campuses in the United States to be really, to face a very sophisticated and very hard-hitting divestment from Israel campaign. That was a resolution that was brought to our student government, and that after 9 hours of public comment, a meeting that started at 7 p.m. and lasted till 6 in the morning, we defeated that resolution. narrowly by a 7-5 vote. Then after the resolution, after that happened, another event happened was that were two of the student council members who had gone on trips. Actually, they were non-Jewish students, but they had gone on trips with the ADL and the AJC to Israel. They were very strong allies of our community who, of course, voted no on the resolution, were brought to judicial board, which is sort of the version of like the UCLA student court for conflict of interest, which is obviously, a very ridiculous charge. And that saga lasted for about another month. Eventually, the judicial board unanimously ruled that it could not be a conflict of interest to educate yourself on any given topic. After that was the elections, in which things got very heated. Myself as a candidate, I was very, very, virulently attacked for who I was. Everyone knew that I was a very strong pro-Israel leader on campus and what I believed in. And there was like a hashtag campaign, Twitter campaign, a lot of nasty comments, and that was a huge sort of very big divisive, emotionally charged moment for everyone. During that same election, another thing happened where that also garnered a lot of press, which was the sort of so-called ethics pledge, which asked student government candidates to pledge that they would refuse to go to trips to Israel or trips to anywhere with pro-Israel and Jewish organizations. So that was also a very troubling incident. That was last year. This year we started, again, we had divestment round 2, which came in November, and in which actually because of, and we can go more into depth, but that resolution passed by an 8-2 margin. And then I was on the student government at the time, and I was presiding over that meeting as well. So I wasn't able to vote, but that's a longer conversation. And then since then, we've had another divestment resolution that also came at UCLA, but it was at the UC Student Association, and that also passed as well. And we organized a rally and protest of approximately 150 students, and were escorted out of the meeting during that time. And then most recently, I think that this is sort of really when the UCLA story blew up, was most recently on February 10th when I appointed a member of our Jewish community, Rachel Beta, who's now quite famous. I appointed her to be on the position of judicial board. She was just a very great pre-law student, very strong candidate. And usually these appointment hearings go very smoothly and very quickly. I sort of appoint somebody, they ask a couple questions, we vote, we appoint them, move forward. And in this situation, as many of you must have heard, that didn't go quite that way, right? And students, government officials were sort of questioning Rachel's ability to remain unbiased, remain clear, remain free of divided loyalties when it came to assuming this position because of her Jewish identity and her connection to the Jewish community. And I think that really, when that story got out, that really started, it brought back the focus to UCLA and brought all these sorts of different events culminating in this episode of anti-Semitism at UCLA. And obviously there's been a lot since then. But I think that's sort of a brief history of some of the ongoings at UCLA. Obviously, I've been asked many times, as I go through this, like I can do this like in an hour, I can do this in 2 hours, I can do this in 3 hours. And someone told me one day that we should make a movie about what's going on at UCLA. And sometimes I actually agree. I think there's a lot of material. But
and Noam, can you address the question or somebody else about whether or not UCLA is similar to what's happening on other campuses around the country, or if there's something different that's happening in our local backyard?
Yeah. So I don't want to take too much space, and I'll definitely hand over the mic to everybody. I think that what's going on at UCLA is definitely troubling, definitely very alarming, and to say that UCLA hasn't been at the center of a lot of these controversies would be a misstatement. But I think two things. A, what's going on at UCLA is happening across the country. Either it's already happening now, or B, it will happen in the next year or two with all these things going around. The second thing is, how would we compare UCLA to other places? I think the reason, and this is something that I'd like to tell people all the time, the reason why you hear about UCLA isn't because it's so bad. The reason you hear about UCLA is because it's so good. The real problem isn't UCLA, right? it's not campuses where there's a huge Jewish population, where we have extremely strong pro-Israel groups, where we have very strong leaders in, who are involved in leadership positions all across campus, right? Those aren't the campuses that we necessarily need to be so worried about, because while there is a lot of friction and a lot of conflict, you hear about those things because there's actually people on the other side standing up and saying what's going on is bad, what's going on is wrong, and we need to do something about it, right? The real issue, I think the real problem campuses, unfortunately, are the smaller campuses, the UC Riversides, the UC Irvines, where there isn't a strong pro-Israel presence, and these things are happening. Not only are they happening to the same level, you see they're actually happening at an even greater level, but we're not hearing about those campuses because there isn't a very, very strong pro-Israel community that's out there constantly and actively fighting against it.
Rabbi Aaron before had mentioned something about identity politics, and maybe I can't speak for every school in the nation, but certainly at UCLA you see this divide where you take your identity and you get put into one of two categories: the privileged and the unprivileged, or the disadvantaged. And what happens is you take the African Student Union and the Asian Student Union, or the LGBT group, right? And you identify in one of these two categories. And what I feel has happened is the Jewish community has had a label put on it, and it's been put in the privileged group, right? And you think, well, that's weird. You go back to Israel and you think about how Israel is just a vibrant democracy where it treats everyone with dignity and human rights, women, LGBT group, LGBT members, the African population, and so then you look at UCLA, and how can these groups kind of come out against the Jewish and pro-Israel community? And it's because identities are politicized, which maybe wasn't the case several years ago or at other schools, which is a problem. And we do our best to work with other student groups and collaborate with them and see how we are similar, how Jews really face the same discrimination and history, and how this identity shouldn't be politicized.
And I think, these sort of like student of color coalitions are the ones that we're seeing all across the nation, right? And if you go to different.
Yeah.
And for example, at Stanford, I think people just heard there's an article that just broke about how the Student of Color Coalition, may have discriminated against a member of the Jewish community. So these sort of alliances that are happening all across the country are, the reason why they're alarming is because groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, or in general Palestine solidarity organizations, are able to infiltrate these student of color coalitions. And what ends up happening is these become the bastion of support for the cause. And these coalitions run student government candidates together. They organize together on different issues, and they've actively pushed out the Jewish community out of those spaces, and it's created a situation in which in general the campus isn't anti-Semitic, the campus isn't anti-Israel, but rather these certain student organizations who are very powerful, very vocal, are very anti-Israel, very and it's incredibly difficult, and it's almost impossible for Jewish students to really break through those different obstacles. And moreover, I think what's really alarming is as we move into the 21st century and the United States become a more diverse place, and these students who are in these groups as college students are going to become be the emerging figures of these underrepresented groups on a larger scale. And it's alarming because these students are I don't want to say brainwashed, but really, fed this information and this misinformation, I'd say, and it's become a part of like their fabric and who they are. And so I think that's, a more nuanced understanding of what's happening on these campuses, and why certain why groups are in support of these divestment efforts, or why in general, we see, you go on these like divestment bills or divestment resolutions, and you see members of, every member of the African Student Union, of the LGBT organizations, they all come out and are in support of these divestment bills. And this is a little bit as to why those sorts of things happen.
I'm not sure. It might be what you were going to ask me.
I'm curious about the 4-year arc of your experience on campus and whether or not there's a lot of people think that things have gotten worse. But say what you want to say, and then maybe we can address that.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I was just going to add to that 2 brief points. First, I think it's important to note that this isn't kind of a new phenomenon in that there are these type of identity politics and coalitions within UCLA. From my understanding, it's been since the 1980s. This isn't new in any way, very, very deeply entrenched. Which isn't to say, as Jacob briefly mentioned, whether it's within the Bruins for Israel kind of group, trying to form coalitions with different diverse student organizations, or also within Hillel in a broader sense. And I don't know if you were going to mention this later, but recently we just came back from a trip to Israel this spring break, where it was 21 students, 4 Jewish students, which I was one of them, and then also 17 non-Jewish students who came on a trip with Hillel to Israel to learn more about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think that was one of the most positive things we've done in a really long time in terms of engaging non-Jewish students. These students were student leaders. Some will be in student government next year, but really from a diverse group of student organizations, whether that's religious, cultural, LGBT students, students from the Latino community, students from the strong Christian community on campus. And I really think not only did it create a community amongst the students who went on the trip, but I really hope to expand this trip in the future. I see it as a really, really positive method through which we can impact non-Jewish students and help them to understand kind of the history of the Jewish people and also the nuances of the conflict.
And I don't want to toot UCLA's horn too much, but I kind of do. And by that I mean that I think that trip is very emblematic of the way UCLA students, or the way our Jewish community at UCLA have really responded to things going on, right? It's not just, there's this petition out there that's telling student government candidates not to go on trips to Israel with Jewish organizations. It's, okay, that's going on. So if they want to do that, then we're going to come out 3 times stronger and create our own trip and bring, 4 times, 5 times as many non-Jewish students that were going to Israel before and bring them to Israel, right? And so I think it was not only about, educating students and creating this environment where more students are involved and actively engaged in these conversations, but it's also, I think it was really an empowering way for our community to go out there and say, not only is this not okay, we're going to do something about it and really show the campus community that, we don't stand for this and that we're going to really fight against it.
And also, to toot the horn, I'd say of the Hillel staff, is that they've been so supportive in this entire process throughout the past couple of really difficult years and challenging years in terms of support that they've given us, whether it's timing, phone calls late at night, or whether it's strategizing, and also really with this trip, really helping us kind of together working on this vision and having it kind of come to fruition in the end is largely a huge product of the Hillel staff and their ability to support us.
I'll actually jump off there a little bit. I know that one of the questions that a lot of people ask is like, okay, so what are you doing about it, right? And that's a fair question. The question that we mostly get asked is, what's your strategy, right? What's the next great talking point that you're going to tell the other side that's going to convince them? I get calls in my office probably twice a week where somebody informs me that, if you would just tell them that Hamas uses human shields and is terrible to women, then this whole problem would go away, right? I said, okay, that's very nice, but you, first of all, have never heard of a concept called anti-normalization, which means that the other side has actually dedicated themselves to not talking to us at all. And they are impervious to argument because they've shut themselves off in their own echo chamber in which they hear their own ideas continuing to resonate over and over and over again. And second of all, we made that point. We made that point a decade ago, right? And we continue to make those points. There was an article that David Suissa put out in the Jewish Journal 4 weeks ago or something, that people love to attack UCLA. Jews love to attack UCLA. In fact, if you remember one thing from this thing, I would like you to remember that UCLA is a safe campus and that you should absolutely send your Jewish students there. And then I have a letter that these students wrote talking about their Jewish experiences at UCLA. That's essential. People must know that. May 1st is the date when students need to decide whether or not they're coming, and they need to come, because the foundation of the pro-Israel community is the Jewish community, and we have an extraordinary and strong Jewish community. The second thing that I would want you to, if you remember just that safe, if you want to remember one more thing, it's that we spend about 50 to 60% of our time fighting people who are actually anti-Israel, and I spend about 40 to 50% of my time fighting with other Jews who don't like what we are doing, or who want to tell us what to do, or who want to, get involved in ways that are appropriate, inappropriate. They have no relationships with students. I deal with 45 different outside Jewish organizations who claim to be involved in Israel on campus. We know 10 of them. 5 of them are helpful. 5 of them are actually really unhelpful. And it's essential that when we think about the history of the Jewish people and 3,000 years of Jewish history, going all the way back to like Moses and Korach, right? People know that story, that Korach rebelled against Moses' leadership and was eventually swallowed into the earth as a result, and God actually wanted to kill the whole Jewish people and start the project over again. He said, what kind of people, right? I just took you out of Egypt. I saved you from Pharaoh. Now you're out in the wilderness and you just started fighting with each other. Right? The moment that we're in right now, we just came out of Passover, right? The moment that happens on Shvi'i Shel Pesach, on the last day of Pesach, is that we sing Az Yashir, we sing the song of redemption, we sing the song of getting out, but now we have a problem because it's just us. And the story of the next 40 years of the Jews in the wilderness is essentially about us fighting with each other, and pretty much nobody from that generation ever gets to Israel because they're not worthy. Right? And they spend all of their time in a slave mentality where they're arguing and they're bickering, and we spend still a lot of time arguing and bickering. So people want to know what the strategy is, and that's great. And there are moments where it's absolutely appropriate to do what David Suissa suggested, which is to take them, to task for what they do. And we want to do that in consultation with the UCLA administration. We have demands out to the UCLA administration who have let this go on for too long. But primarily what you're going to hear from us and what you're going to hear from our students is the ways in which proactively we're addressing it. So proactively we're sending 60-plus students to APAC. Proactively we're sending the only non-Jewish trip for students from a particular university to Israel to go actually come back, right, and say, guys, I was there, and what you're saying about it is just lies, right? It's not this apartheid state. Where, yeah, you're right. I was there and I saw divisions between Israelis and Palestinians, but you're also wrong because what you're saying about Israel and Israelis is simply not true. And then we do a lot of relationship building projects as well. We have a project called Bearing Witness, in which people get together, non-Jews and Jews with Holocaust survivors. They learn about genocide, and then they actually work on genocide projects together. They work on social justice projects together. We have Challah for Hunger, which brings people together. These guys execute a few they call them Party with Jews, every year, in which they get together and they actually just have a party, right? And they facilitate relationships with people who are on campus. We do interfaith programming. We're starting a Hillel International Fellowship right now called Resetting the Table, which is designed to do dialogue. And those are the ways in which we're actually going to make success here. There are ways that UCLA needs to be involved. I met with an administrator today who talked about actually exactly some of this, helping people to build relationships with each other. Right from the get-go. You come to UCLA, you learn that you're part of the True Bruin community, and you learn what that means. You learn about respecting one another, but more importantly, you build real relationships. You're not lectured at, you build real relationships with your peers. Because when you have a relationship with somebody, you can't talk to them in the same way as when you're just attacking them with no relationship. So I want to address that just because we started talking about strategy, and you guys actually are just sort of naturally talking about all the things that we do in a proactive, constructive kind of way, instead of in a way that's just about coming and besmirching somebody else, which is not really an effective message on campus. Do you guys want to say anything about strategy on campus?
What do you think the administration should be doing that they're not doing?
Great.
Talk about strategy.
Yeah. You want my list?
Yeah.
Okay.
First of all, it's important to know about the university culture that students are powerful, that students can get meetings that other people can't get, that the chancellor really doesn't care about any donor who's less than $25,000 or so, right? Like people who are like, I'm pulling my money from UCLA and they give $500, like the chancellor's not even, it doesn't go, it doesn't go in. And by the way, it's the wrong message. Right? Like if you were to approach UCLA as a group of alumni and say, we're really concerned and we really care about what's happening at UCLA and we want to help you solve this problem, that's totally different than coming from the outside and threatening to beat you up. Right? And that's what some people in the Jewish community are doing right now. I'm going to beat you up if you don't do, what I said. It's like, really? I'm part of a $4 billion institution. Like the donors need to come in conjunction with students, and that's something that we're doing right now. So we're talking about creating opportunities for students to build relationships. We're talking about interfaith programming that's actually done with the university. There's a new diversity requirement on campus, and that could go either way, right? People from, who are not friendly to Israel could take that over and could spread a message that's not healthy. Or we could get really involved proactively and make sure that there's courses on anti-Semitism and make sure that there's courses on building relationships one with another. So there's something around maintaining a positive learning environment. These students who were kicked out from Oklahoma after that racist chant people followed this a little bit. They were on the bus. There's a student code of conduct and a hostile learning environment and other methods that you can use on a university that aren't just about strict freedom of speech, right? It's not true at the university that you can just come and say whatever you want and get away with it, especially not as another student attacking another student, right? So that's something we would like them to be paying attention to. The United Auto Workers this past year passed a full-on BDS resolution. The United Auto Workers represent the TAs and graduate students for whatever reason at UCLA. They passed it locally. The administration issued a letter condemning it and instructing TAs not to perform on the advice of the union, but they never actually circulated the letter, so we want the letter circulated. We want those as the official instructions from the university. I think that it's worth considering the possibility that there are students and groups on campus who might actually be hate groups, and that we have to actually call them that if that's what if they're consistently performing and showing themselves to be hate groups and bringing people who bring hate speech to campus, then you have to figure out what to actually do with that. So that's like I have 4 or 5 others, but yeah. Wouldn't it be there? Yeah, they absolutely should be. They absolutely should be involved in that. Up to this point, yeah. Why don't you guys talk about your experience in talking with administrators? Because in my experience, right over the last 24 months, you've had frustrations and now you've had successes, and I think that would be interesting to just talk about the inside conversation.
I mean, I guess I'll start by saying that, in my current position, I really have the opportunity to engage with pretty much the highest level of administrators at UCLA and UC-wide. And in my conversations, whether it be with UC President Napolitano, the Chancellor, the Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, all of those people have unequivocally stated to me, that there will be no BDS at the University of California. There will be no divestment, from Israeli firms or from firms that deal with Israel. And that's not something that we're going to be enforcing academically either. I'm going to put away the mic because I can't see it on the record, but even Chancellor Block, like those words and those comments that he made at the Jewish Journal are all things that I had heard previously before. In addition to that, it's really good to know that UCLA will be, is announcing soon that it will not only not engage in BDS, but it's planning on actually strengthening its ties with a university in Israel. So that's very, very positive developments. But other things also that are happening is that they really do take this problem seriously and they want to help. The main issue is that their hands are tied to a certain extent because it's very difficult, and almost sometimes it wouldn't help us for administration to really step in as decisively as we may want them to. And that's because if an administrator were to, if sort of how when your parents tell you not to do something, like you want to do it more. So similarly to that, if administration were really to come down as hard as as some of us would really like them to on certain groups of students, it may actually end up backfiring, and it's like it'll turn from an Israel-Palestine thing to a administrators meddling with student affairs situations. So it's a very delicate balance. But I guess I can pass it over to Natalie and Jacob, who have been, sort of involved in those smaller conversations about what's going on from the administration standpoint.
Right. So one thing that Aaron mentioned is in the past, we as in Hillel kind of student board and different Jewish organizations on campus have not had either maybe not the most communicative relationships with administrators on campus. This year it's really changed for the better in a really, really positive way. We've met multiple times with I think, Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs, and she's been kind of an ally for us and kind of trying to even understand where we're coming from, which I think was a really first important step. And then now really working in terms of moving forward, and more so kind of what I've been focusing on in my position and in speaking with her is really improving the communication between different religious groups. So in terms of Jewish Muslim relations on campus, that's something that I've taken a huge effort personally, and then also through the administration in terms of how do we make sure that we are facilitating dialogue among those student organizations and really making sure that it's more of a structured thing that the administration can help with to facilitate. I mean, I think in some ways what you're saying, from my perspective, I do think it's maybe an issue that administration maybe didn't ignore, was more monitoring and wanting to take a hands-off approach, kind of something that Avinoam mentioned before, which although to us in some ways seems so incredible and difficult to understand, they have a very strict distinction between what is student issues and what the administration is allowed to involve itself in. And that distinction is really, really frustrating at times. And I think because unfortunately of the events that have happened, they are slowly understanding that they need to take a very active role and a strong stance on this. But it is late, and that's disappointing.
I would also, in my perspective, I would never view the administration and UCLA as, I don't want to say anti-Semitic, but not caring about Jewish student issues, because they really do. And it's funny because when Avinoam was talking about that divestment resolution that was passed last year, I totally forgot, but Chancellor Block, he was in Israel at the time that it was happening. Because it's a public university, they want to be very careful about where they step their feet. I also just remember Natalie and we serve on what's called the Committee on Academic Freedom, and we review cases of academic bias, mainly, so not student groups, but professors and graduate students. And we meet once a month or however, and around the time, I forgot his name, it was Steve Salida, right, at the University of Chicago, who was sending out pretty anti-Semitic, anti-Israel tweets. And this was something that came to us, and the administrators had asked us, what are your opinions on this? This is also around the time, there was a speaker who came, Omar Barghouti. He's one of the leaders in the BDS movement, had spoken at UCLA very previously. And they asked, do you think this is fair? Do you think these speakers are crossing the line? Or these centers, the Center for Near Eastern Studies, do you think it's fair that they were able to sponsor this sect of speakers and not pro-Israel speakers? And it's really great that Natalie and I, we're in these roles and we can tell them that, it crosses the line. It certainly does. And I personally think they do listen. But like I said, as a public university, they need to be very careful about where they cross the line if they want to receive federal funding.
So I think it's naturally moving towards questions. So let me just get a sense of who has questions. One. Okay, so let's actually just go in order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, great.
So Jacob, you started talking about what I was going to ask about, but I'm more curious because I started UCLA in '94, and I was very entrenched in identity politics. I was a women's studies major, and the question that I have is, in your personal experience, do you feel like the discourse, the academic discourse about Jews as minorities, as disenfranchised minority, historically, is kind of in your learning, or taught to other students on campus, or that's been totally erased?
That's been completely erased. I mean, I think that's one of the issues that we have is that this is not, the students are on a day-to-day, the ones like doing the activism or are involved in these sort of conversations. But one of the biggest issues we face is, who's in the background that's kind of keeping this institutional memory, and those are the professors. And quite frankly, the professors in specifically those departments, right? The African American Studies department, the Chicano Studies department, the LGBT department, the Women's Studies department, which now the Gender Studies department, are extremely anti-Israel and are willing to put that in the classroom, and that definitely does not help our cause at all. It's very, very difficult.
UCLA is not a high school, right? So at a high school, you go through a certain amount of, everybody takes English, everybody takes physics, everybody takes, whatever it may be. The universities don't work like that, right? So there is a GE requirement, and there is going to be a diversity requirement. So on the one hand, you have professors and departments that are hostile to the notion that you're talking about, which is whether or not Jews are a protected minority, and don't teach that narrative. On the other hand, you also have the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, and you also have a very robust and vibrant Center for Jewish Studies, right? So, and those are university departments with professors who teach and are authentic and all of those other things. So sometimes it's like emotionally tempting to look at the things that really bother us, but we also forget that the university already has, and it will continue to have, a growing partnership with Israeli universities, with these centers. Like, there's students who are taking Jewish studies and Israel studies classes in the thousands at the university, right? So are they the same studies who are people who are doing Chicano studies? No. So our narrative is not represented in Chicano studies, but as in the university as a whole, it certainly does have representation.
Thank you. So I just want to, I have a whole bunch of suggestions, but I won't, no, you don't want suggestions. This is a question. I view the problem as an administrative, institutional problem on one side, and then the day-to-day life of your issues on another side. I think on the day-to-day life, you guys are superstars. I mean, you're in the trenches, you're doing the best you can. I think we are failing you on the institutional side. And unfortunately, I have to, with all due respect, I think that Hillel is also failing the students. And the way that I see it is, you mentioned just now, well, how are we going to break a $4 billion institution? Well, the way that AIPAC has been able to work its way to be the third largest lobbying group for Israel in the United States. So we can't, we can't, as the Torah teaches us, go and say, oh my God, these are locusts, these are giants in the land of Israel, we can't get in there. No, we have to be able to create the pressure for these guys to be successful. And we can't say, oh, it's too big. No, it's not too big. If I understand that there's no question. The question is, why would you not consider things like a divestment program from UCLA by all its Jewish alumni? Not for the money, but because of the media, right? The media would hear it and go, wait a second, I know it's not a lot of money. On $4 billion, what can we give, 100 million? Okay, it's not a lot of money. But we have to create that. Now, I'm not in UCLA, I went to UCLA. This might be more of a problem for them, but my question is, why not be more aggressive? That's my question.
I mean, I think from my personal experience, I think, look, I agree. I think the outside community can do more in terms of pressuring the administration and getting involved and making sure that it understands how serious this issue is and how seriously the outside community takes it. So yes, I agree. You all can be doing more. But again, my personal experience with UCLA administration or UC administration in general is that they're not stacked against us. Rather, they want to help. They're just not sure exactly how. And I think the best way to do is positive engagement. Like, again, if that's the route that you think the most effective thing to do is to go and ask Jewish donors to divest from UCLA, I mean, power to you. But again, in my own personal experience, what I've found to be effective has been positive engagement, and instead of trying to, so I think on the contrary, what we need to be doing is instead of divesting from UCLA, is investing in UCLA, and that means ensuring, not increasing our gifts to the institution, but really while doing so, leveraging the relationships that we're creating with development, leveraging the relationships we're creating with the administration to apply pressure so that they do work harder to create a more inclusive, a safer, and a better environment for Jewish students at UCLA.
Look, I would say that the university is a slow-moving ship. I agree with Avinoam that the university and the administration have been problematic in their response, but that they're not the enemy, right? So the enemy that you're fighting is probably one or two Saudi princes who have poured about $40 million into a decade-long campaign to defame and delegitimize the state of Israel. That's the enemy, right? And those are the people who you should be trying to identify and attack and go after. The university, I think, actually, has a relatively sympathetic ear. They wish that it would go away, right? It is true. I feel like the administrators have said to me, God, I just wish this whole thing would go away, and I'm sure they do wish that it would go away, right? But they also waited until things got elevated enough that it got their attention, right? Because they have watched a lot of things come and go over 40 years, and so they have a relatively high threshold for, now's when I'm actually getting involved. I see them involved. So I would rather work with them from the inside than, I just don't think it's time to storm the gates right now. I think that if we weren't making any progress, we would be here saying, let's storm the gates.
Hi, my name is Dana, and I just want to say, as somebody who was president of Har Hillel for 2 years, kudos to you all. And that was a long time ago. I went to Smith College. And I have to say, fortunately, the most that I ever encountered during my 4 undergrad years was a lot of ignorance. My question sort of is in light of the fact that I'm raising a 12-year-old who attends Jewish day school here and will continue on in Jewish day school in Milken, is anti-Semitism. So up until a few years ago, anti-Semitism was, you're Jewish, I don't like you. Today, I don't like Israel is anti-Semitism, and therefore I don't like you because you're Jewish. So, and I feel as if my identity has sometimes been wiped away because that leap has been made. And obviously that's what's been happening on campus these days. So my question is, how do you feel students on campus, Jews, non-Jews, define anti-Semitism? Do they define it that way too? And how do you bear the weight of this sort of newly defined anti-Semitism, and how can we help you with that? I mean, I'm news, I read Facebook, lots of articles and whatever it is, and I have to say, I'm very concerned about what kind of world my son is going to grow up in, and it may not be as utopian as my own, and that's very worrisome.
Yeah. I would first start by saying, we actually just the other day had what was called Bruin Day on Saturday. It was when all of the prospective Bruins came in, got to come up to the Hillel tent and the Bruins for Israel tent and ask, what is it like being part of your group, or being Jewish at UCLA? And a parent had come up to me and said, be honest, do you feel comfortable walking around campus? And I said, look, is there anti-Semitism at UCLA? Yeah, just like there is at every other school in this country. Do I think it's a problem? Not so much. I feel very comfortable walking on campus. I personally don't wear a kippah, but if I did, I would. If I wore a Star of David, I would. I don't feel physically threatened. Unfortunately, several students at other universities do. And we've been lucky, we're very lucky at UCLA to have such a strong community. And I would say Hillel certainly is one of the driving forces of that. I would say it is dangerous to be anti-Semitic at UCLA. Because if you saw what happened to this girl who asked the question about the student government, the judicial board, you're Jewish, can you be impartial? She, I feel a little bad for her. She may have ruined her career. I don't know. It's dangerous to be anti-Semitic at UCLA. That's the first part. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
Do you feel that other students define anti-Semitism as maybe like hate Jews, or do you feel somebody defines anti-Semitism as somebody who is
Sure.
anti-Israel,
Sure.
and therefore
Sure. They do, the opposition, I guess I'll call them, tries to do a very good job of distinguishing anti-Semitism against Jews versus anti-Zionism against Israel. The problem with that is if you are only focusing on Israel, then it's obviously anti-Semitic, right? I mean, maybe Avinoam can say more because I know he...
First of all, I really appreciate the question because, quite frankly, that's an incredibly thoughtful question, and I think it's something that we're wrestling with, and I think the entire Jewish community at large is wrestling with, how are we defining anti-Semitism in this new age? So I think, one, you're right. The anti-Semitism of today is not the anti-Semitism of yesterday. It's not, being beaten up because you're wearing a kippah or something like that. But I think today we really need to we need to figure out what that line is. And so one thing that I like to do, and an exercise that I like to take on with other people, is to talk about, for example, one of the big topics of this year has been the issue of police brutality, right? And the issue of police brutality sort of comes down to differential treatment, right? We talk about, we have laws that call for equal protection, laws that say that every person is given an equal chance and the same opportunities and everyone should be treated the same. But however, let's say, for example, the statistics for marijuana possession, right? Marijuana, blacks use marijuana approximately the same amount as whites do. But blacks are 2 or 3 times more likely to be stopped, be arrested, be prosecuted for that same illegal activity. And what do we call that, right? We call that racism, right? And we're not afraid to say that term. And I think sometimes, when it comes to this Israel conversation, and we say, that we're here fighting for universal rights, we're fighting for universal freedom, we're fighting for the liberation of all peoples worldwide. But if in practicality, if in actual effect, what is happening is only the singling out, the targeting of the Jewish state of Israel, we need to not be afraid and say, just as I called that racism for differential treatment, I'm going to call this anti-Semitism for the same differential treatment. So I think that we need to be better at saying that, and we need to be unafraid and unashamed of putting that out there. However, I will say that we need to do a better job in our community of policing the term anti-Semitism when it comes to criticism of Israeli policy. And I think that it's something that's happening across the country, but even in our own community, different people across the spectrum are feeling differently about the elections in Israel, are feeling differently about what happened in Gaza this summer. And we need to make sure that in those conversations, the people who are being critical of Israeli policy, we can't automatically brand them as anti-Semites. We really can't do that. We need to stop doing that, because not only is it not effective, quite frankly, I mean, it's look around the country. I mean, these different, very right-wing groups who have spent a lot of time branding everybody who criticizes Israel as an anti-Semite. These BDS resolutions are still gaining strength. These Palestine Solidarity movement is still gaining strength. That's not an effective tactic. And the second part of it is that what we're actually doing is really alienating a lot of people who could be our allies, who should be our allies, right? And those are the moderate liberals who should care about Israel, because it's really the paradigm of what it's like to try to establish a democratic society, Western society in the Middle East. So I think that that's sort of where I'm at in terms of the anti-Semitism conversation. We need to be unafraid to use it, but at the same time, we need to be cautious about branding everyone an anti-Semite when we just don't disagree with everything they're doing.
I think also another kind of thing to point out is that there still is that ignorance problem, and this recent incident really highlighted that for us. And another kind of step moving forward is different ways in which we can attack that ignorance and try to ensure a more educated student body, specifically related to anti-Semitism. So kind of tangible steps, just so you know, and the rest of the community here knows, tangible steps such as specifically related to that event, whether it was kind of the resolution that we created condemning anti-Semitism. There was a seminar course in which some of the students who were very vocally opposed to the appointment of that candidate are enrolled in this class regarding the history of anti-Semitism, and that was something that we, as a student Jewish community, insisted upon. I think they felt so guilty and recognized that I think also, I mean, one thing that I would say is I think the students who said those completely derogatory comments recognized the how harmful their words were, and in that way they were very receptive to working with us. We're also planning a workshop for all of the students elected to student government to attend, hopefully 4-part workshop in conjunction with ADL and other organizations. So we are taking steps more so to combat that ignorance, which I think is really prevalent in a lot of different veins and venues.
I hate giving like examples of anti-Semitism at UCLA, because then like that's all people remember, and then they like forget all the good stuff, and then like, but I think relating to this issue of the new anti-Semitism and how it relates to the identity politics and this oppressed versus oppressor dichotomy that is promulgated, a comment that a friend of mine overheard one time in one of these spaces. So that's these social justice multicultural centers, pretty much the equivalent of the multicultural center at UCLA, was maybe the Jews need another Holocaust to figure out what being oppressed is, right? And I think unfortunately like into this new anti-Semitism, right? That like the Jews are so privileged these days. We're so privileged that like we don't have, we don't even know what we're talking about anymore. We're not legitimate sources of information, not legitimate sources of knowledge when it comes to the world around us, and informed sources when it comes to talking about discrimination or problematic things that we're seeing. So.
Well, I wanted to address this gentleman over here about Hillel. I was at Hillel last night, and I invite you to join a group called PIMS, which is a pro-Israel mentoring society, and I mentor a student, David Chernobylsky, who put together the Zionist narrative because he did not have a voice. He tried to submit an article to a UCLA Jewish newspaper, and it was refused because it was too pro-Zionist. My question is, I think you guys are really impressive, and I've learned a lot, but while we're pontificating and trying to create legislation, and we're trying to go to the chancellor and have him make a statement, the opposition is marshaling the immediacy of the internet to, I mean, ISIS conscripts armies over Facebook, and the opinions that are fashionable now to be anti-Israel are broadcast over the internet. And our mistake, I feel, and my question is, what are you doing about it, or what can we do about it, is how do we meet them head to head on this adverse publicity that they're sending out, and while we're sitting here in a temple which is so lightly attended, and there's so much apathy in our community, and you guys are trying to, let's get people to Israel, and in 4 years you'll be out of UCLA, and someone else will come in with the same problem. In the meantime, they are just pushing forward through social media. What can we do about it?
Sorry, I don't like taking up too much space, but you're right. Yes, we as the pro-Israel movement need to do more, need to be better at using technology, at really being tech savvy, really putting out our information in a easy to consume way, in a way that really is up to the taste of the younger people. But
You had said before that things are not bad at UCLA, things are good. But things are horrible at UCLA. I mean, you have to really kind of admit that everything that's being done is, is just like you're pushing a small ball up a mountain, because the force of hatred coming at Jewish students at UCLA is oppressive. It's never been like this before.
So this is fascinating, and this is where I'll jump in, because I hear this narrative sometimes about UCLA has really blown up, and it's related to your social media question. At UCLA, there's a very well-funded and well-organized tiny group of students who are pushing a particular narrative about Palestine and about Jews. And they've been successful in recruiting 500 to 1,000 other students. Hold on. 500 to 1,000 students, and they get a ton of press. Because the press is largely ignoring the reality at UCLA, which is 29,000 other students who we need to be focused on. Because what they've done, and actually one of the limits of social media is that social media still echoes within itself. So, a good experiment for you would be to open a private browser when you get home, and open a Facebook and just look and see what the trending articles are in a Facebook that doesn't have your cookie on it, and then go look at a Facebook that does have your cookie on it, because it serves you up different stuff. Like Facebook and Google have actually designed an algorithm to give you the stuff that you want to see, and it becomes this self-reinforcing, what they call confirmation bias, right? It's continuing to push you the stuff that you believe. But the reality of what these students are experiencing, which I try to always expose myself to as well, you'll walk into a room where you're like, I cannot believe that that's happening in that room. Right? Saleda, who is an anti-Semite from UC, Champaign-Urbana, is in there talking to 100 students, and he's saying offensive things, and that's not right. And then, you walk outside and you realize that, the Carl's Jr. line is longer than all the people who are in there, right? So I think that, I don't want to be an anti-alarmist. I think that there are ways in which the internet has become a very powerful weapon, essentially, right? And if you haven't seen Monica Lewinsky on her most recent TED Talk, fascinating, right? First of all, just fascinating to see Monica Lewinsky, 20 years later, and talking about her experiences. But she actually addresses the way in which the internet changed everything about the way that she was bullied. But I also think that you have to realize that when you look at your Facebook feed, and I know this because I have two different Facebook feeds. I have my old high school friends who I keep in touch with, and I have my UCLA account. And my UCLA account is like this alarmist Jew who's constantly feeding me all of this stuff. And my Facebook account on my other one is like, my friends had a baby, and whatever else it is, right? So I just think that we have to be careful about how far we go in legitimating how strong they actually are. So we ran an experiment this year to see what would happen if you don't go down and stand across the Palestine awareness wall that they bring to campus with posters. Right? Because really what these guys are after, they're not after divestment, they're not after resolutions, they're not after divestment from the UC. They know that none of those are possible. They're in this thing to defame and delegitimize the state of Israel, which means that they want the maximum amount of attention that they can possibly get. So we said, okay, if that's what they're really after, what would happen if we did not give them the attention? So I sat across from the wall at Blue Room Plaza, and I watched them largely be ignored by students who just really care about getting a job, right? And it's great that you're being a mentor for somebody, because that's like the number one concern that just about every student has at UCLA. The people who came up to them were wearing hijab or already knew them, right? They were not effective in broadcasting their message, and I know that they weren't effective in broadcasting their message because on Friday, an exhibit that was not connected to Palestine Awareness Week, it was like a 3D printing exhibit came, right? And I happened to go play racquetball that day at the gym, and they were swarmed. There were like 2,000 students who were like, wow, 3D printing, that's cool, right? So 3D printing is by far more popular by an order of at least 20 times of magnitude on my non-scientific, than the Palestine Awareness Week wall was. So I just think that we have to be careful with the alarmism of social media. There was another question.
I was just curious to know, you mentioned that because of funding, the administration's hands are kind of tied as to how much they get involved. I went to USC. I'm just curious to know. I shouldn't have said that.
It's okay.
So did I.
I'm just curious to know what your perspective is on if they deal with these issues differently, or the non-UCs and the private schools.
I mean, I don't have like extensive knowledge at all, but my understanding is that, I mean, whenever you're a private university, you have your own rules and you can kind of do what you want. And so in that way, just in a simple answer, given that it is a public university, and a huge public university, the hands are extensively tied based on different laws and protocols, and kind of abiding by specific rules that are already set out that are kind of can't bend them at all.
It's happening at Vassar, it's happening at Wellesley, it's happening at private universities everywhere in the country.
Yeah.
I mean, I think each university is a little different.
Yeah. And by the way, what you're seeing is they inserted themselves into the conversation 10 years ago very quietly. So, and they did it strategically, right? They trained people, and we have a graduate student who's on my campus, Rahim Kurwa, who's almost certainly funded by them. We can't track it, we can't figure it out. But you have a 28-year-old who's been involved in this for 7 years, who we're expecting, 19 and 21-year-olds to come and, fight. And this guy's a writer, and he's trained, and he's got professors on his side, and he's got, but they started that a decade ago. Right, so it shouldn't be surprising that they're starting to bear fruits. The other thing that I'll say is that USC just reminds me about this conversation that I had with a colleague of mine across town who's a Muslim student advisor at USC. And he said, listen, I want you to understand something before we start talking about all of this stuff that we need to talk about. I want to slap the 19-year-old version of myself. Right? Like, he has a recognition that, like, there's stuff that happens when you're between 18 and 22 that seems totally normal. And if you think about your own college experiences or whatever they may be, and the stuff you did when you were 18 and 22, that is changing radically by the time that people are 25 and 30. So we need some kind of longitudinal understanding to understand what's happening with these students who are being exposed to this message, right? Pretty broadly when they're 25 and 30, because the danger is not actually what's happening on campus. The danger, to go back to AIPAC, the danger is what happens in the United States government, right? And if the United States government is no longer an active supporter of the state of Israel, then Israel's got a real problem, right? A divestment from HP is not destroying the state of Israel. But that's what we need to strategically be thinking about, and that's why I would rather focus, we put all of our focus on these other loud, radical, small groups of students. I would rather focus on the middle, right? And the people who need to see both a positive image of Israel, and they need to see a version of Israel which they find relatable. Which they find relatable as an American, which they find it relatable as, a melting pot of culture and Ethiopians and Russians who are living together, right? There's so much that Israel could be doing in terms of its positive reputation that's just not happening because we're so invested in fighting right now, and I'm not sure it's the right strategy. I just want to make sure that everybody who was in the original queue got to ask their question.
Well, I work at Cal State LA, where there are maybe 10 Jewish students during the day and maybe a couple hundred at night. So they're moving onto my campus also surreptitiously. They had Saleda there this year, sponsored. What I'm asking from you is, we need help on other campuses where they're not large supported groups, with what we can do. I mean, we need to, I don't know what you can do with coming up with fact sheets. I don't know what you can do to come up with ways that professors can mobilize or other people can mobilize on other campuses, but you're lucky to be in your community. Students on my campus, not so much. So I'm wondering what we can do to have you help other communities across the country mobilize on their campuses.
Sure, I'll start. Well, so from a Bruins for Israel perspective, last year was the first year we've been begin cross-state coalitions. Okay. So we're actually in contact all the time with Cal State LA and their Jewish students, as well as many of the CSU schools and all of the UC schools, as well as some private ones. And every year we hold this big conference at UCLA or somewhere else, and we share strategies with each other. We're going to continue to do it, and that's really something that we need more support for.
So I also want to thank Megan Konofsky, who's here, who's coming from the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles, who's made a big investment now in Hillel 818. You're getting a new director who's awesome. Yep. And that's actually like, there are organizations which help us. I talked about the 5 organizations that are actually helpful to us. The Federation is actually helpful in this regard, helps does cross-pollination. We have retreats for people who get together. They have their own programming that's actually largely run by our staff. So there are and will continue to be efforts to create a more citywide.
So Rabbi, I'd like to, let me ask sort of a final question of everybody. And that is sort of where we started. So what can we as adults, okay, who are concerned, what can we be doing to help you, support you, be with you, lead? I mean, what is it that you would like of us that would be helpful in what you are doing?
The first thing I'm going to say is donate money. I mean, honestly, it sounds like a simple thing to do, and I know that there are 45 Jewish organizations out there telling you that they're working on this issue on campuses, and so keep donating money. And if you haven't done yet, then do so, because it is necessary and is needed, and a lot of organizations are doing really good work. What I will ask you to do before you donate money, though, is give me a call and ask me if this organization is doing work at UCLA's campus, because I'm very aware that there are a variety of different organizations that say they're doing work at UCLA, and there are many of them that are not doing anything. So if you have a doubt, please call me. I can give you all my number, and I can tell you if a given organization is doing a lot of work. So that's one, but I think that, and I think that's to some extent a very crucial part, but I think it's only one part. The second part is be actively involved in these conversations, right? Whether it be through actively lobbying, or working with the different people to coordinate lobbying to the administration, working in your own circles, whether it be through APAC, whether it be through whatever organizations, to continue to influence legislators, decision makers around the country or around the city on this issue. And the last part I would say is to be as supportive as you can be. And I know that's a really difficult thing to say, but just as I am not fully aware of all the things that are going on in the outside community, and I couldn't tell you about the politics of Stephen S. Wise Temple, which I'm sure there are many politics of, there are no politics of the Stephen S. Wise Temple. And while I think that there can be a lot of input that can be gained from the outside community, I think sometimes there needs to be greater faith in the students. And I'm not going to say I've done everything perfect. I'm not going to say that our community's done everything perfect, because we've messed up plenty of times, and there are times that we could have done things better or whatever it may be. But the students really do know their campus. The students know the people. Know the people on the campus, know the groups, know all the dynamics. And if a campus community chooses to go in a certain direction, or chooses to do something or not do something, I think that the first instinct of the community, of the outside community, should be that's probably right, and then only the second instinct should be, okay, what could be done better? Because I think that oftentimes it's the other way around, and I think the default needs to be we trust the students, and but also we want to help them find ways to organize better and all that. So those are some things. I'm sure.
Right. I mean, I think you said it very well. I just also want to thank you for asking that question, because I think a lot of the times, from what we've had in our experience in the past 2 years, is outside organizations, outside individuals say, I know what's best, I'm going to go in and do this because I'm passionate and I care about this. And while we're appreciative of that passion and that desire to help, I think sometimes there's a gap kind of in communication, in that sometimes it ends up hurting the students because there's not that question as to how can we help you. And I think the most important thing kind of in that relationship is the communication aspect. I think in general we are so eager to work with outside organizations, whether that be pros organizations or individuals or synagogues. But I do think that line of open communication and kind of, we would love kind of in a situation like this to help explain our campus to you, and definitely open to, like Avinoam said, criticism, to suggestions. But at the end of the day, we're the students who are on the ground. We have the relationships with the people in student government, with the administration, with up and coming leaders. And I think the most important thing, kind of to glean from what Avinoam was saying, is to trust us and help cultivate us in a way that there's that open kind of line of communication.
I can't really add too much new to what they both said. It's really about being on the same page. And maybe Rabbi in a minute can talk a little bit about the new initiative we've been kind of sparking. So it's real. This kind of forum is really what, like, Natalie, Avinoam, and I'd like to see. It's students getting on the same page with community members. That way, come problems, on campus, we can sit down and address them and tell you what we need, because it's not always just what do you need? What do you need from the community? What can we do now? Maybe it's nothing now, but maybe it's something in the future. And I think these kind of forums are absolutely helpful.
Yeah, I mean, we've actually started a forum which is significantly even more participatory than this forum was. We started a Bruin Alliance, which was meant to be people who really care particularly about the pro-Israel community at UCLA. If you want to send me an email, my card is on the sheets that if you flip it over, you'll see that my card is down there. I'm happy to put you on the list and to invite you to events. Basically, what we'll do is sort of a round robin kind of exercise in which we'll find 20 students who you can talk to, break you up into smaller groups, and actually invite a dialogue. Because you do have things to offer, and you do have experiences. Like, I agree with you, Avinoam, that the first instinct needs to be to trust the students. And I also think that what I've witnessed is that you guys have learned a lot from, people who were at the university 20 years ago, right? Like, Avinoam just met with a guy named Lindsay Connor, who was the student body president, like, in 1982.
He doesn't like to be identified.
Well, okay, fine. You don't like to be identified. Fine. So those are instructive and powerful conversations, and I want to make sure that you're included in those things, if at all possible. The number one thing that you can do for us is to make sure that Jewish students who who are considering UCLA right now come, because this is the best Jewish community that you can join, basically anywhere off of the East Coast, bar none. There's 2,500 undergraduates, there's 500 to 600 graduate students, 1,600 to 1,700 students of those are identified and engaged in Jewish programming. You will not see those metrics on just about any other campus, certainly not on the East Coast. We have the only place west of the Mississippi that has a daily minyan. We have the only campus with significant kosher food. We have, Shabbat can be 200 people, 250 people. Like, it's a robust, just at Hillel, right? And then you have Chabad, you have JAM, you have other organizations that are on top of that. I want to say a special thank you, and I want to end just by thank you to Rabbi Spike, and also to Jeff Resnick and to Frank Ponder. Frank Ponder is our former board president, and Jeff Resnick actually is our current board president of Hillel at UCLA.
Thanks, Aaron. I just want to make a commercial. I am the new president in a few months now, and I just want to say that we are looking to expand and increase our board of directors. So if any of you were moved and touched by this tonight, and you'd like to talk about what you can do and how you can get more involved, I would love to chat with you, number one. And number two, this group, these four people are unbelievable. I mean, yes, they have balanced lives. It's all not fighting anti-Semitism, but bottom line, they are all unbelievable. And these three students have such incredible futures. And I know they'll continue to be active and involved. And Aaron is becoming the new Rabbi Aaron Lerner will become the new executive director, and we are very excited about that. But from a like practically every Jewish organization in the country right now is struggling financially, and we are too. And we have a lot of work that we need to do, and unfortunately, you can't do it with thin air. It takes money. So with that, and we always want more people, but when I look around the room, I mean, we really have, in my opinion, this is quality. So instead of quantity, we have incredible quality, and I'm really pleased that you all came out to listen. And this is a road show, and they will continue this within our community. But thank you very much, and if anybody wants to talk further, I'm happy to be around.
So I just want to echo everybody's thanks, and a special thanks to my colleague, Rabbi Spike Anderson, for advocating within the Stephen Wise community to make something like this happen. And I hope that this, I know that this will be one of many conversations that we'll be able to have with students at UCLA and at other schools in the area, trying to bring alumni together as well and to bring our community together, because this really can't be a one-off conversation, but rather a deep conversation and deep connection, because we're connected in very deep ways. We share a 5,000-year tradition. We share values. We are mishpacha in the deepest sense. So Avinoam, and to Natalie and Jacob and Rabbi Lerner, thank you so much for being with us. I just want to close with a connection to where we are in the Jewish year. Of course, tonight is the beginning of Yom HaShoah, and this is, there's a beautiful article written by a friend of mine that talks about how these days are the Yamim Noraim HaYisraeleim. The Israeli High Holy Days are the days between Yom HaShoah leading up to Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut, and they're very, very heavy days. And today in Torah study, on Wednesday mornings, I teach a Torah study class here. Probably not so convenient for you guys, but if anybody else wants to come, it's 8:15 on Wednesday mornings. I tuned in to Galei Tzahal, the Israeli Army radio, to illustrate how, because I knew it was already sundown in Israel, that when you live in Jewish time, you feel Yom HaShoah in a different way. I said, I'm going to turn on Galei Tzahal. I said, I don't know what will be on the radio, but it will be a sad song about the Holocaust. Of that I am sure. And in fact, it was. But what was really interesting to me was it was a contemporary setting of Psalm 23. Which is traditionally recited at funerals. Adonai Roi, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And when we think about what it means to be connected in the ways that we're connected, it's I think, to have the hope and the strength and the belief that our tradition, strong as it is, ancient as it is, dynamic as it is what will help us confront whatever the challenge is. And so we have a challenge to confront, and we'll do it with strength, and we'll do it with seichel, with wisdom, and we'll do it knowing that our people has walked this road before. We will walk this road, sadly, again, but we will get through this as we have before, and as we know we will again, because we are strong, and we care, and we're thoughtful, and we're organized, and all the things that have given us strength to make it through all the challenges that we've dealt with are the kinds of things that will help us to confront this challenge. And I know I speak for everybody in this room when I say that looking at you, listening to you, gives us a sense of hope and strength, and gives us a sense of chizuk, of real energy, so that we can confront this together. So thank you for your time tonight. I know you've got a lot of other things that you're dealing with. I want to appreciate you for that. On your way out, my colleagues have some handouts for you. There's a tangible way, in addition to supporting UCL Hillel and all of the other local schools and all of these efforts and synagogues and everything that makes Jewish life possible and the values that we care about possible. There's an election going on right now, which is the World Zionist elections. You have 2 weeks left to vote. All you have to be is 18 years old and say that you're Jewish. And pay $10 to register. How many of you have already voted in the WZO elections? Okay, that's not enough. Everybody in this room needs to vote in these elections because it's a tangible thing we can do for Israel to make sure that our voices are heard so that Israel will be the kind of Jewish state that we want it to be. On the way out, you can grab a flyer. You can vote any way you want as long as it's for Artza. I'm on the slate. I'm 105th on the slate, and I think it's exceedingly unlikely that we will get 105 spots. But that's not the reason to vote for Artza. The reason to vote for Artza, or actually any platform that you care about, is because your voice does matter. The final thing I'll say is that it's not just Yom HaShoah tonight. It's the counting of the Omer. And so we'll say the blessing if you care to join with me in the blessing. One of the lessons of the Omer is that we count down from the first night after Passover to Shavuot. And one of the beautiful teachings about counting the Omer is that when we count our days, we are reminded to make our days count. And so by coming out tonight, when you have all sorts of other things that you could be worrying about and all sorts of other things you could be doing, you're making a conscious effort to make our days count as members of the Jewish community. So the blessing, the last words are Al Sfirat HaOmer, Baruch Atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher Kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al Sfirat HaOmer. And yesterday was the 11th day of the Omer. So that means today is the 12th day of the Omer. Hayom 12 yom shem shavua achad v'chamisha yamim la'omer. Thank you so much for being with us. We really, really appreciate it.